y'all didn't come to hear me, y'all came to hear Kate, and I forgot.
Maybe not.
And since I forgot I can't find my introduction sheet, I just was freaking out about it a minute ago, and I thought, well, what am I going to say? And I thought, well, everybody knows Kate. That's why you're all here. And you know that how great she is and her accomplishments. And so I went to look at some of her comments that her students made. And don't look at me like that, Kate. It's all really good. She's the funniest professor I've ever had. She cares about her students. We love her. We'll take all her classes. That was just all these positive. They were trying to get a good grade, or they really meant it. I don't know, but it was all good stuff. So please join me in welcoming Kate Stewart.
You never know when somebody's going to turn up at one of these things that you can't imagine. When one of my students, Ethan Danner, wave your hand, shows up. He was an undergraduate, and now this is why I think he's here, is that he's taking a graduate linguistics course from me this fall. So he said he was working at Arca Butler. He knows better than that. That wouldn't help him. I believe I've said some harsh things to Ethan over the years about certain items. But I'm glad to see all of you, and I appreciate greatly your coming. There's that sense of being nervous about saying, oh my goodness, you should have worked harder on this. You do have, and I think just about all of you have access to this reading list. Now, we know that the screenwriters and the actors are on strike now. So if you need something to do in this interim, you can read some of these. Now, with the exception of Intruder in the Dust and The Reavers on this list, two William Faulkner novels, we went through each one of these except for those two in the Literature of the South class this spring. Now, this is not, I assure you, this is not exactly one of the lectures that I gave in that class or that we worked on together or anything, but this is an authentic reading list of what I assigned in here, and I did put dates down here to give you some sense of the chronology and that sort of thing. I'm one of these people who likes order and organization, so I tend to teach things in chronological order, which is what I did here. But I want to start out. I don't know how much you took seriously the topic when I said what we can learn about ourselves in a Southern literature class, but I think there's something to be said for that. I have to give some credit to another graduate student, and I happen to be directing his master's thesis, for the inspiration behind this paper in some measure. I've done some things like this, but this may be a little bit different approach to saying, if we'd be here all day if we talked about everything that it means to be a Southerner and what we know about ourselves. So I did what I would tell a writing student to do, is pick one thing and focus it on that. Well, this student has given me some food for thought as I've worked with him over the last semester and will continue in the fall. He's doing his master's thesis on food in Eudora Welty. And he and I have had interesting discussions along the way. By the way, our master's program is completely online, so unlike Ethan, I've never met this student except via the electronic waves. I have mixed feelings about that kind of program, but be that as it may, we're going to talk about food in these works of literature. And they're actually from the novels that we read. I want to start out with one of these famous passages from William Faulkner, and this happens to be in Absalom, Absalom. I don't know if people make too big of a deal about it or not, but it takes place later in the novel when Quentin Compson has enrolled in Harvard as a freshman, and his roommate, Shreve, asked him at one time, and he indicates that other students have asked him as well. I mean, there's a world of difference between Jefferson, Mississippi, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. There is a difference. And this is what Shreve asked Quentin. Tell me about the South. What is it like there? What do they do there? Why do they live there? And then, if you explore more in Absalom, Absalom, you find a really good passage earlier in the novel. And this is what it says. It's just incredible. By the way, I will mention that if you're going to read Faulkner, you might as well get used to some of these non-specific pronouns with it, because what we're actually referring to here, you can probably draw several ideas. It's just incredible. It just does not explain. Or perhaps that's it. They don't explain, and we are not supposed to know. We have a few mouth-to-mouth tales. We exhume old trunks and boxes and drawers, letters without salutation or signature. Yet something is missing. Now, if you haven't been in the frame of collecting letters and old trunks and pictures and those sorts of things, you need to realize that's part of your legacy. I have too much legacy. That's why it's hard for me to go through some of the stuff I have. And the something missing that I want us to talk about is food and some of the implications of it. So you can't sit down and read Faulkner and find anything else, anything about food. But I think it's a way of finding out something about the South. Now, I want to start with one of these family sources. It happens to be a diary that my grandmother decided all of a sudden one day in 1935 that she wanted to keep. She decided to keep a diary. And she, unlike some of us, she managed to write just about every day. And by the way, if any of you get this piques your curiosity enough to read my grandmother's diary, I donated it to the library, to the museum, because it had gotten frail, and I sit down and enjoy that facsimile copy that I have, which is why I was able to use this. One of the things she does in there is that she'll go somewhere for supper, or her family will go somewhere for supper, and she'll list every item they had as a meal. And she'll list the meals that she would serve. Now, this happens to be a dinner. Now, we're in exactly the right place. All we got to do is venture up the street slightly to the old William Faulkner birthplace. The original one that was torn down in 1950, because I know this is where this took place. Reverend and Mrs. A.J. Ransom. Now, he happened to be the pastor at the New Albany Presbyterian Church at this time, had invited as dinner guest Reverend and Mrs. W.S. Boyce, and he was the pastor at the Bethany Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. Presbyterians have a bad habit of being clannish. And Reverend and Mrs. R.N. Hunter, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, and my grandfather was the pastor at Ebenezer and Hopewell. They were the ones in attendance, and it has, this was the menu. They started out with grapefruit. Now, you consider this would be the appetizer. Well, no, I won't try not to be too nasty or anything. Well, that wouldn't. But let's just put it there. This is a company meal. They started out with grapefruit. They had baked chicken with dressing, mashed potatoes, sweet pickles, pear cheese on lettuce. Now, that thing's making a comeback. People have mentioned that pear, and how many of you are going to sit there and say, we've had that pear? And cheese salad, we've had that. As a matter of fact, I think I've got the fixings for it in my house as we speak. Strawberries and whipped cream, cake, and coffee. Now, when my grandmother and my grandfather had a company meal, and this happened to be with some of the young teachers from Tipper Union. This is what she served to them: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green peas, which I suspect were fresh from the garden because this was like in the end of March and those peas would come in early. New carrots. Now, I do not honestly know if they grew carrots or not, because carrots are not easy to grow around here. The Hunters had lived in West Virginia and came in with some odd ideas, like they would have planted rhubarb, probably. Peach pickle, green tomato pickles, stuffed eggs. Now, she did not put down deviled eggs. Stuffed eggs, tomato and cream cheese salad on lettuce, Jeff Davis pie. And you say, now wait a minute, I've never heard of a Jeff Davis pie. If you run across something like that, all you have to do is do what I did. Run a Google search. Just put in Jeff Davis pie. And I gathered, I'm a little afraid about doing a Google search because I may get silenced for doing that. Well, given the political angle on that. But evidently, from all I can gather, given the recipe, a Jeff Davis pie would be either an egg custard or a buttermilk pie. And the only way I draw a distinction with a buttermilk pie is you might put nutmeg in it, which I've done that. Hot biscuits and coffee. And what I remember about my grandmother is she liked to set a beautiful table. I was thinking about this, and I think it was at Christmas at her house that was the first time I saw a baked ham that was studded with cloves. Now, I wasn't that impressed with it, but our tastes change as we age. But my grandmother loved to set a pretty table for the meal. And in light of that, when my mother started teaching school down in Lee County with her first paycheck, she ordered her mother a set of china from Montgomery Ward to have for these meals. Guess who still gets to have that china? Now, to get down to business, there's a passage from All the King's Men, by Robert Penn Warren. Now, I don't know, we've got some here who are probably more interested in politics than some others. But if you want to read something about Southern politics, I couldn't help but think about some of this as we were going through All the King's Men, because it is politics in the South. I have not been, I honestly will admit, I have not been to that many political rallies. For some reason, I remember going to one at the Ripley Courthouse. And it was at this time, and there's one similar to this in All the King's Men, when you would have, I think it was when Paul B. Johnson Jr. was running for governor. Yes, I can remember back that far, I'm afraid to say. And he always had with him the Magnolia Quartet. And I remember that. I don't remember anything about what Paul B. Johnson Jr. said. I don't think I'll cause too much offense here, maybe so. But my parents didn't vote for him. Of all things, they voted for Rubel Phillips that year, who happened to be a Republican. Now, who would vote for a Republican for governor that year? Now, of course, what I'm saying now is the reason that my family supported him, and this is a total lie, is that Paul B. Johnson Jr.'s father did not reappoint Aunt Alice as the head nurse at That is true. That is true. So it was out of spite that they didn't support him. I just think that is funny. The other political rally I had any notion of, I've never been to Neshoba. You know, some of you may be going to the Neshoba County Fair next week. The schedule is out of what day to go and listen to the speakings. This was when Ross Barnett was running, and they were having a political rally that they broadcast on a radio station. And I remember the line from that, and I'm probably misquoting, but I can just hear Ross Barnett's words of, "We're barbecuing some fine Mississippi chickens here today, but I would like to do some barbecuing of my own by sizzling some of the birds." I thought that was just, in retrospect, probably didn't realize at the time, I thought that was just classic, well done comparison. By sizzling some of the birds who are using Bobby Kennedy money to defeat Ross Barnett. Now, why that sticks with you, I don't know, but if you want to get some insight into this, you can find that in All the King's Men. And you don't have a lot of food in there. You do have a barbecue at one of the political rallies, but generally, you don't have much food in there, maybe because a newspaper person is narrating that thing and talks about going to Willie Stark's home place. And Willie Stark's wife has prepared a meal, and I think this sums up what a southern table would be like. We sat down at the table. Lucy, that's Stark's wife, wiped the perspiration-soaked wisp of hair back from her face and gave a last-minute look around the table to see if anything was missing. You can just almost see that with the one who's in charge of the meal in a home, look around and make sure you put everything out like you were supposed to. Like a general inspecting troops. The gesture and the look of a good woman who knows how to set a good table and knows how good she is, and it is, and by God won't stand any nonsense out of you if you try to dodge that third piece of fried chicken. Now you tell me that doesn't tell us something about being Southern. How many of you have seen somebody who's prepared a meal to do that? You don't get much food in Absalom. Absalom is probably tied with Light in August as my favorite Faulkner novels on a certain level. But you don't have much food in Absalom, and when you do, the main characters in there are having to grub for food. Miss Rosa Caulfield is having to feed her father, who by this time doesn't want to go into the war, so he's sealed himself off in an attic, and Miss Rosa is having to take food up to him in the attic. And she has been pilfering out of their store to have food. Now, I could not find that passage in that novel, and I know it's in there because I did not make it up, but the neighbors would even put baskets of food on her front porch when the Caulfields got in really bad shape. You have some of this same grubbing for food out at Sutpens 100 with their living off the kitchen garden. And occasionally somebody will fix game for them. Now, the reason I added Intruder in the Dust and the Reivers to this is that we do get some good Faulkner food illustrations. Intruder in the Dust opens with a young man, Chick Mallison, aged 13, 14, who falls into a creek when he's out hunting, and a black man in the community by the name of Lucas Beecham takes young Chick home, and it happens to be around lunch, and he serves him a meal. And this is what Chick says about it. His home, and Lucas shares this meal of collard greens, a slice of side meat fried in flour, big, flat, heavy, half-cooked biscuits, and a glass of buttermilk. And Chick says about that meal that it was exactly what he expected. It was what Negroes ate. Now, Chick breaches the rules of hospitality. He tries to pay for that meal. You can read that either as Chick's being just ignorant or like the rest of the community condescending toward Lucas because he doesn't know his place. And that sets up this tension throughout this whole novel, this one scene with I'm glad I didn't have to have that meal, by the way. There's several of these meals that I'm glad that I haven't had. But that was Chick's assessment. And it set up this rivalry that they were going to have. Now, in contrast to this, Lucas holds this over Chick's head for some time. And when Lucas gets charged with murder, and everybody knows he didn't do it, he asked Chick to go out to Caledonia Cemetery and dig up the body to prove him innocent. Well, Chick and his friend Alexander and Eunice Habersham go out there and exhume the body. Well, it turns out that the victim there's a different body in the grave. So they have to go tell the sheriff this, and they get Gavin Stevens, who is Chick's uncle, to go with them to the sheriff. Now this is, Steve, you mentioned about breakfast at 4 o'clock in the morning. The group worried about Sheriff Hampton not being up because it was so early in the morning. It was a little bit fuzzy in there. It was either 3 or 4 that he was up. And Gavin says, no, he's already up cooking breakfast. He's a country man. Any food he eats after daylight in the morning is dinner. One of the most interesting things that came out of all this junk that I started hearing was this, do you call it dinner or do you call it supper? And I think it was Russell Baker one time who said it depends on what time you eat it. If you eat it after 6 or something like that, it's dinner. If you eat before 6, it's supper. Do that with what you will. I just thought that was interesting in here. Any food he eats after daylight in the morning is dinner. When the visitors enter the kitchen, they smell, quote, coffee and frying hog meat. We picture this scene, and Faulkner, I'm going to have to give Faulkner credit. He does a wonderful job. This is, in some ways, a very minor part of this novel, but the description of it, it takes from page 106 to about 112 or so of the text of this that I have to explain all this with this supper. I'm not going to read that whole thing. The sheriff stood over a sputtering skillet in his undershirt and pants and socks, his braces dangling and his hair mussed and tousled. Now you can get that picture in your mind. It has to be a wife beater t-shirt in my mind. I'm sorry. A butter cake turner in one hand and a cup towel in the other hand. And then Miss Havisham takes over slicing the rasher of bacon. There's a lot of discussion about wielding this big butcher knife to cut that bacon. You know it was thick cut. A rasher of smoked meat is also on the menu with fried eggs, leftover biscuits, which were like toast. In the Reavers, the characters seem to eat a little better. When Lucius' priest parents and grandparents catch a train so that they can attend a funeral on the coast, they leave with, quote, the shoebox of fried chicken and deviled eggs and cake for dinner, noon meal probably, since there wouldn't be a dining car until they changed to the limited at the junction. I've got to be honest with you, I'm not sure where the junction would be to catch the train. Used to be it would have been in Batesville. I don't know, and of course if you want to take the limited, if you want to take the city of New Orleans now, you can go pick it up in Greenwood. The passenger train runs through there, so I'm not quite sure. Of course, Faulkner didn't care about that too much. Later, when Lucius, Boone Hagenbeck, and Ned stopped for the night en route to Memphis at Miss Ballinball's, the travelers have evidently a good meal because Lucius observes, we had supper. And I know why the hunters and fishermen came back. Now, we can read between the lines there without in trouble. Miss Ballinball sent with them on their journey the next morning with an ample lunch. The ham and fried chicken and biscuits and homemade pear preserves and cake and the jug of buttermilk. I don't know if that was leftovers from the night before or not, but arriving in Memphis at Miss Reba's establishment, now that bawdy house of ill repute would be what we needed to say about that, or I could take it downhill from that, but that's where we are, down on Catawba Street. The group enjoyed a Sunday supper of cold food. Now you tell me this hadn't happened to some of us. Fried chicken and biscuits and vegetables left over from dinner. When the group travels to Parsham, Tennessee, and this would be the fictionalized Grand Junction, the next day, Lucius recounts the food at Uncle Parsham Hood's house. The daughters kept the breakfast warm. And the breakfast consisted of fried side meat, grits, hot biscuits, and buttermilk or sweet milk or coffee. And while this was out, she was also cooking the vegetables for lunch. Later in the day, Miss Reba and her entourage, who had checked into the hotel, dined on pork chops and grits and biscuits and blackberry jam for supper. Okay, Faulkner does get on my nerves about his punctuation sometimes, but then I teach advanced grammar, so I can't help it. I would, however, I'm gonna cut him some slack with these things because it gives you a cadence when you start and. There's a certain, so I'm willing to look the other way a little bit, or a lot. And then the next morning, a continental breakfast gets served of hot biscuits and milk. Now, Lucius needs that because he is going to participate in a horse race. If you haven't, they made a good movie out of the Reavers, but the horse race kind of gets on my nerves, but that's okay. Later in the day, Lucius returned home with Uncle Parsham and had supper at 5 p.m. as, quote, country people, farmers ate. Lucius highlights the menu: dishes of cold vegetables which should have been eaten hot at the country hour of 11. Added to this fare were hot biscuits and 3 kinds of preserves and buttermilk. With these descriptions, Faulkner definitely marks distinctions between city and country culinary habits. By adding the bill of fare at Lupus Beecham's house in Intruder in the Dust, we note the disparities in foods consumed by the poor and the more affluent, and I use that term a little loosely. I think it goes beyond, as you see there, I think it goes beyond. Their chick says that the meal that he had at Lucas's place was what Negroes ate. I think you see a sameness in all of these meals. I've just mentioned as one, this is a scene that always, from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. In this Southern Lit class, a good bit I've taught Richard Wright's Black Boy, and I decided I had not visited or revisited Invisible Man for years and years and years. And this is about, the character is only named Invisible Man. And he was in that exodus of blacks who left the South in the 1930s and went to New York or Chicago. And this Invisible Man happens to go to Chicago. And he's doing all he can to get away from his Southern upbringing until he starts walking down the streets in New York. Then, far down at the corner, I saw an old man warming his hands against the sides of an odd-looking wagon, which a stovepipe reeled off a thin spiral of smoke and drifted the odor of baking yams slowly to me, bringing a stab of swift nostalgia. Invisible Man remembers baking potatoes on the hot coals in the fireplace at his childhood home, and he thinks about that. He muses, hot fried pies, sweet potato pies. I thought sadly, moving away. He did buy one of the potatoes though, and he was ashamed that he wanted the potato and had eaten it with such relish. I would have probably had indigestion if I ate one. Now that I no longer felt ashamed of the things I had always loved. And that he's immediately drawn to those sweet potatoes. It's a little bit like Faulkner on that. We spread that sweet potato episode out a good bit. Now, To Kill a Mockingbird and Go Set a Watchman, both by Harper Lee, introduce us to a different world of food. Instead of going with these just basic, what we'd call country meals, you tend to get more party food in To Kill a Mockingbird and Go Set a Watchman. Now, Scout and Jim in To Kill a Mockingbird are not thrilled with their Aunt Alexandra. Neither am I, except I'm gonna have to say she is just really a finely tuned character. She's a good character. Although the Finch youth would rather not spend Christmas at Finch's Landing, they took comfort in the fact that Alexandra was an excellent cook. That's ultimately the only reason they wanted to go to the Christmas dinners, is because their aunt could cook. The Christmas menu was bountiful. 3 kinds of meat, summer vegetables from her pantry shelves, peach pickles, 2 kinds of cake, and ambrosia. And Scout summarizes that meal by saying it constituted a modest Christmas dinner. When Aunt Alexandra moves to town, she quickly establishes herself as a truly exceptional hostess of teas and the Missionary Society. Go Set a Watchman offers some extra details about her entertaining. For a tea in Jean Louise's honor, this is from Go Set a Watchman, she prepares delicate sandwiches. Earlier, when her niece went to the grocery store for her, Jean Louise reads the list and wonders, what does she want with cocktail napkins? The owner of the store clarifies, she means party napkins. And then when we have this description of the spread at the tea alongside the party sandwiches, we find, quote, a tray of cocktail napkins. I don't know why I find that so funny, but I do. Find the references to specific cakes in To Kill a Mockingbird especially informative. This is what set me on to this topic, I'm ashamed to say, I suppose. When Aunt Alexandra comes to town, Miss Maudie bakes her a lane cake. Now let me read the passage. As says this about lane, as in L-A-N-E, that the lane cake was, this is what Scout says about it, so loaded with shiny, it may be tight. Shiny is slang term for moonshine. Shiny. When Miss Maudie's house burns and Mr. Avery, the across the street neighbor, is so helpful, he shouldn't have been climbing up on roofs. It did him in pretty badly. Miss Maudie says she is going to bake Mr. Avery a lane cake. Lane cakes are mentioned twice in To Kill a Mockingbird. Now this is a passage. Soon as I can get, well, by this time Miss Maudie's living in the same house where Mr. Avery is. Soon as I can get my hands clean, and when Miss Stephanie Crawford's not looking, I'll make him a lane cake. That Stephanie's been after my recipe for 30 years. And if she thinks I'll give it to her just because I'm staying with her, she's got another thing coming. And this is what Scout says on this. I reflected that if Miss Maudie broke down and gave it the recipe to Miss Stephanie Miss Stephanie couldn't follow it anyway. Miss Maudie had once let me see it. Among other things, the recipe called for 1 large cup of sugar. Now, I don't know why it was in some old cookbook that was around the house. I think it's one that my mother got as a wedding present when she and Daddy got married. But I had seen lane cakes. Well, Google is so much fun. I decided to prowl around about lane cakes. Long story short on this, as of 2016, I believe, I want to make sure to get the date right. You don't want me to lie about it. Yes, 2016, Alabama voted the lane cake as its official state cake. Have any of you ever eaten a lane cake or had any experience with one? I was tempted, but I didn't make one. A woman by the name of Emma Rylander Lane of Clayton, Alabama, made one of these things for a county fair in 1898. And she baked it in 4 pie tins instead of regular cake pans. You know, I think you're supposed to always do something different with a cake that you enter in the fair. And this is kind of like one of these, it says it's sometimes confused with the Lady Baltimore cake. Now, what you have is probably one of these sponge cakes, and the truth is in the icing, that it has a lot of dried fruit and coconut, and it does have Martha Stewart's recipe. If anybody wants it, we can supply the website. Martha Stewart, which I trusted her recipe more than some others. It has about a half a cup of bourbon. Well, they use moonshine in the one in To Kill a Mockingbird. All the recipes I've seen suggest bourbon. And I did toy with the idea of making one of these things for my class. And I decided it was too much trouble because one of the features on this is that what it says traditionally about it, and this was my whole point with these cakes in here. Traditionally, the lane cake is labor intensive. That thing was made in a day when you did not have electric mixers, and even egg beaters were not particularly reliable and good. And it would take 15 hours traditionally to make that cake. Miss Maudie would have probably had access to some other things, but it still would have been labor intensive to make those lane cakes. Another cake mentioned in there, now this isn't quite as labor intensive, but it is the angel food cake. And when Scout and Jim have been terrorized by Bob Ewell, and they finally make it through that crisis, and Bob Ewell's not a threat anymore, the sheriff mentions angel food cake. And they finally meet Boo Radley too, by the way. And this is what the sheriff says to Atticus. Maybe you will say it's my duty to tell the town. Know what had happened then? All the ladies in Macomb, including my wife, would be knocking at his door and bringing angel food cakes. Now, like I said, from everything I read in these recipes, a lane cake is much more complicated than an angel food cake. I'm not going to set forth on baking either one of these things, I don't think, at this stage in my life. maybe better not say that, but what I want to point out about this is, what I think we see is with the lane cake and with these, this is something where somebody goes to trouble to do something nice for somebody. And that lane cake would have been one of those. I think we have other desserts like that take special effort to make. The last novel that we did, I don't know if any of you have read Where the Crawdads Sing or not. All I could tell my students when I got to the end of that thing, and I'm not much into contemporary fiction, but I got to the end of that novel, and I said, the only thing I have to say about the end of that novel is, well, son of a gun. You know, that's all I could say. That was just it. That was it. I couldn't say anything else. But it is interesting when you see the food in here. The main character in here, who is called the Marsh Girl by the community, and her Kia Clark is abandoned by her family before she's 10 years old. And I mean, this is everybody. From the time she is 7 or 8 years old, she is living on her own. And some of the, let's just say this, we may find some of the worst elements of food insecurity I've ever seen in my life in this thing. I mean, this doesn't come up to anything you read in these others. When they a lot of times for breakfast would have corn fritters or hoe cakes. And one morning her brother was cooking, before he left, was cooking grits and scrambled eggs in lard. Although her father was technically still there, he was absent most of the time. Emblematic of her abandonment is her food. For 3 days, Kia boiled turnip greens from Ma's garden for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Pa's continued absence brings more decline in the menu. There were no grits, but rummaging around, she found an old greasy tin of Crisco shortening, dipped a bit of the white fat, and spread it on a soda cracker. Now, her survival skills do well, and she starts learning to sell fish, and because she's on the coast, unlike being inland, she's on the coast and has access to different seafoods, and she starts selling it. It does better. I thought one of the most interesting things that speaks to me about food in here and what it does, at the end of Where the Crawdads Sing, you have recipes. Now, there again, somebody hadn't struck into making these. I got a little tempted about the hush puppies, but you have 5 recipes in that book for Paul's hush puppies, Ma's breakfast corn fritters, Kaya's mussels and grits, poor man's turnips, and old-fashioned chicken pie. And that, I mean, you know, like I said, food's not that stunning in here. Now, what do we do with this? Food does tell us a lot about our culture and our life and our hospitality. I had lunch the other day with a friend of mine. We met first time as freshmen at Northeast Community College, those many years ago, and are still friends, and he's a Presbyterian minister. And he is planning to do, and this, I mentioned something about this, and he's planning to do a series of sermons on food in the Bible, because he talked about the significance that meals and food have, and I think that's what this speaks to me. You know, you do have the Foodways project at Ole Miss. They do a lot with Southern culture and food. And I noticed that they're advertising on SEC Network now that they're going to start, they already have productions, some new shows in that True South series that John T. Edge does. They're gearing up for the fall with some of those. But I think food does tell us a lot about culture, and I always get nervous at this point to see if anybody has any questions.
You didn't say anything about pimento cheese. Oh my gosh, we've never had an event here that we didn't have pimento cheese. There's gotta be some thread in there.
No, well, I wanna tell you, seriously, I didn't see any pimento cheese in there. Now, the other one is chicken salad. I didn't see anybody eating chicken salad either, but those are two kind of staples of Southern cuisine.
Yep.
That some of those delicate sandwiches may have been pimento cheese or cucumber. Well, now listen, a cucumber sandwich is a good supper. I don't care whether it's party food.
Okay, there's, on the history vault, there's about 100 series, 100 episodes of how food formed America. And it is amazing. We all talk about the financiers, the railroad people and all that. The food arguments and the revolution of all the food is major part of how the McDonald's, the bird's eye peas, it really enlightens you as to how food is made. One other thing, you casually threw out the term company supper, which is your words not taken from these books, and I'm sure everybody here knows what company supper is. There are those that would think IBM prepared a supper right there instead of company came over for supper.
Yeah, well, that point taken. So, you know, when you're dealing with Southern students, you don't worry about that because they know stuff. They know. Although Northeast Mississippi and Southeast Arkansas are two different worlds. They are.
Food-wise? Everything like
Not as much food-wise.
They have coon suppers in Arkansas.
Yeah, Gillette, Arkansas. Coon supper. Well, they had more
It's a
volume
big
on that
political thing. It's
because
major, it's all tied into politics.
Marion Barry, it's one of the,
Yeah.
Marion Barry died not too long ago, and he was the one that started that coon supper. Well, the McGee, Arkansas Men's Club has an oyster supper every February as a fundraiser. All you can eat oysters and fried oysters, and well, they have them on the half shell too. But I've been to that. I've been to it.
What is a poor man's tournament? What in the world
I
could it
think,
be?
well, poor, it's spelled P-O, so it would be a corruption of poor man's. That in other words, they didn't go to very much trouble to fix those turnips.
You don't go to much trouble anyway. I don't know what it could be.
Well, see, this is where I'm defiant of my southern roots, I suppose. I'm not a big eater of greens and mustard and collards and those. Now, I do grow kale. Now, go figure. I grow kale and Swiss chard on my front porch.
Do you know what poor man's pepper is? Was that included in that recipe?
No, it wasn't.
Poor man's pepper? It's a little weed that grows out in the wild that is a type of pepper that people use when they can't afford
Well,
expensive pepper.
I imagine that's some of the origin of, I can't, now listen, I'd be afraid to eat poke salad. Now, I would just really be leery of doing that because I'm afraid of getting poisoned anyway.
I'm living proof that you don't die from that.
Well, Well, I do appreciate all of you coming. I hope this wasn't a big disappointment. I don't know what happened. Well, this got started in some other novels when, and the writing wasn't particularly good. I was teaching a course in pandemic literature, and it was one about the influenza epidemic called 1918. And there's one reference in there that says, it's set in Boston, that says they went to the new pizza restaurant. Well, that sent me down the track of looking up the advent of pizza, and this is when I found out about the Neapolitan pizzas, that there's a regulation on that. And then a couple of nights later, on Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives, they discussed that very thing. Now, I did make one of those, so that wasn't in trouble.
Thank you, Kate. You've never disappointed.